Hello and welcome to Dynasty 365 here on Fantasy and Frames. Tonight is episode 2, where we're talking about rookie wide receivers and tight ends for the upcoming 2025 NFL Draft. I'm your host, JT. Along with me is Aiden. We are going to get things going right away here on the show. Stick with us here on Dynasty 365. Aiden, thanks for joining me tonight. Jorge, unable to make it down with a little bit of the sickness tonight, so he's got to take the night off. Me and you will hold it down for tonight. How's everything going, man?
Oh, I'm doing great. I've been writing a lot of articles for the site. Obviously, we wish Jorge the best. We want him back next week, obviously. But like you said, we're holding it down here, and I'm very excited to talk even more wide receiver and tight end prospects, which obviously fantasy players love that side of the ball. So we'll just get right into it.
Yep. So last week, in case you missed it, go back and check that out. That was our first episode on rookie wide receivers and tight ends. We talked about 6-7 players in that mix. A couple of the guys at the top of draft boards, a couple guys that are sleepers. We're going to do a little bit more of that today. A few more of the sleeper end on this episode. So talking about maybe some guys a little bit farther down people's lists. Guys we like, everything like that. Jamie, welcome in, says, hey, dudes, thanks, man. Thanks for joining the show. Always appreciate it. So our first guy we're going to talk about tonight, like I said, we're going to jump right into it, is Jaden Higgins, a wide receiver out of Iowa State, originally from South Miami, Florida, 6'4", 214. A really nice score at the combine, ran a 4.47 with a 1.53 split. 1.53 split on the 10-yard is very nice. 39-inch vertical, 10.8 on the broad jump. He was top 10 wide receivers ranking as far as overall athletic score. This is a guy who got his career started off at Eastern Kentucky, kind of worked his way up, played really well there, then eventually transferred to Iowa State. You didn't know if that was going to translate going to the next level, as he kind of was pretty dominant at Eastern Kentucky, but he did. He went to Iowa State, ended up being a third team Associated Press All-American, second team All Big 12, as he had 87 catches for 1,183 yards, 13.6 yards per catch, and led the team with 9 receiving touchdowns. Really nice game, really nice season for Jaden Higgins. One of these guys we've seen that went from a small school to a bigger school and was able to make the jump. Now the question is, can he make that jump again to the NFL? Aiden, what do you think?
I'm going to say yes. I mean, you obviously said lower level to higher level. That's still within college, but still, that's a big accomplishment in of itself. But I want to preface this with this, JT. I'm sure you'll agree, but him running that fast and testing that athletically dominant at the combine at his size is just ridiculous. 6'4", 215 pounds darn near. I mean, if you need a true X big body boundary receiver who has some downfield, a lot, as we can see, athletic juice, and surprisingly who can separate and run routes very well at his size, I just think early to mid-second round, he's your guy. He's also one of my brand guys personally. I've been warming up to him a lot over the last 2 weeks since the combine, because you probably don't know this about me, but I tend to gravitate towards these tall, big body, possession plus style receivers. Now, the NFL doesn't make guys like this anymore. Like, there's no titans of human beings. Like, let's be honest, there's no DK Metcalfs walking around every day anymore. You're seeing the more like Zay Flowers, some more shifty receivers. Even a guy like Taj Johnson, who's tiny compared to Jaden Higgins. Going back to Higgins himself, though, I think he's, I don't want to say a rare breed, but a guy of a mold that NFL teams will covet, since the NFL, like, there's not guys coming like a DK Metcalf, like I just mentioned, coming in the NFL anymore. I am for sure expecting him to go early to late second round. I personally want to take him here, but JT, I want to pose this question to you. Predictively, could you see the NFL falling in love with his athletic testing and especially size to where he goes in the late first round of the draft? Because it's kind of warming up to me as we get closer to April 24th or whatever.
Yeah, I tell you what, I've he is a guy who's moved up on my list throughout going through just all this offseason, looking at draft, going back, looking at what he did at Iowa State. Not a lot of people saw him play at Iowa State, but he was really, really good there. Jamie pops up here and says, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett had a baby. It's Jaden Higgins. It's really interesting because at Iowa State, he was kind of the DK Metcalf, while Jalen Noel was the Tyler Lockett in that group. Though those two guys played well off of each other. I think he can do that again in the NFL. He has moved up my list. He is in my top 5 to 6. He is like right there. I almost like him more than Matthew Golden. I know that seems crazy to say, as everybody really loves Golden. I'm not as high on Golden as some other people. I actually have Higgins as my wide receiver 5 and Golden as my wide receiver 6 in this class. So that tells you how much I like Higgins. I really believe we've seen so many really good small wide receivers the last couple seasons come out, and those guys have had success. But we're starting in this class. We're getting a good mix of every variety of wide receiver, and we're getting a really nice mix of size with Higgins, Trey Harris, Ted McMillan. I mean, there's some bigger guys in this draft, and even in the mid rounds, a guy we talked about last week, Pat Bryant, is another one of those guys, good size that can play the X. I really like Higgins. I know he's right now kind of being projected for that late second, early third round. I'm really actually going to be surprised if he makes it past mid-second round.
Me too.
I think there's going to be a couple teams that miss out on a wide receiver. And if, we've been seeing lately in a lot of mocks, some of these wide receivers are dropping out of the first round that everybody thought would be first rounders. I think we're going to see quite a run on wide receiver in that top to mid second round in this draft. If like a Luther Burden or Mecca Ibuka or any of those guys somehow, I don't think they should, but they somehow drop out of the first round, get in the second round, I think teams are going to be scrambling to get those guys. And I think you're going to see Trey Harris and Jaden Higgins are the two guys that I think teams are going to be all about trying to get them in that top to mid second round. Again, if he goes late second or early third, I think that's an absolute freaking steal. I'd want to be all over that as the team. And then fantasy wise, to me, I've seen him go everywhere. It's really going to depend on the draft capital. But for me, if he's getting to me in the mid to late second round in fantasy, I'm pulling the trigger.
Yeah.
If he gets to the third, I get him in the third, I'm absolutely losing my mind. I'm like, I just stole something. So I like Higgins a lot. The size, I tell you what, the combine for me, I had some questions. The combine for me sold it. Him running that 4.47 at his size, 6'4", 215, with ridiculous. That nice 10-yard split was phenomenal. And then you saw his athletic ability, the 39-inch vertical jump, the 10.8 broad jump. I mean, those are absolutely top-end numbers for a wide receiver. So you add in the production, and then you add those numbers. I tell you what, him and Trey Harris are two of my favorite guys. And we talked about Trey Harris last week on the show, so I won't get heavy into him. But they're two of my favorite guys because they can play that X position, and they've got good size, good speed. Higgins is actually faster than Trey Harris, but they're two guys that went from the small school to the big school and then made it happen. Absolutely showed out going from a smaller school, obviously Eastern Kentucky to Iowa State for Jaden Higgins. For Trey Harris, he went from Louisiana Tech to Ole Miss. Both these guys, I think, are just underrated players. I think they both got a chip on their shoulder. I think they both are like, hey, nobody wanted me out of high school. Now I've proven I can do it at the high school level. Now I want to go back and prove it again at the college level, and I want to get them there. So I'm really liking the upside of where Higgins can possibly go. Jamie jumping back in and says, I got him at the 302 in a mock draft yesterday. Daco's FF Universe podcast, 302 steal. Absolutely. If you get Higgins at 302, I think you're jumping for joy. Are you going to be able to get him at 302 once the actual draft happens?
No.
Probably not. I think he's going to be easily a early to mid second rounder, depending on where he goes. Because again, look at this. If he goes, say he goes top of the second round, say like Tennessee or
where I was thinking
Carolina or the Browns, like someone like that doesn't go wide out at the top of the first round, they're going to be, all those teams need wide receivers. They're going to be eyeing guys at the top of the second round. We saw it last year. A lot of players right at the top of that second round, boom, 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 right off the ball, right off the board. Lad McConkey's. You got the Xavier Legette right at the end of the first round and top of second round. We saw those guys come off the board. Keon Coleman. So I think you're going to see. I think these guys are going to come off the board earlier than people expect.
Is it? I just want to jump in here quick. Is it fair, like how you were talking about this class? Is it fair to say that this wide receiver class isn't as star-studded like it should be or usually is, but the depth and middle round of this class is really good?
I like the depth of this class. There's a lot of guys that I think have huge potential. Now, obviously, there's a lot of guys that could go either way. I mean, I could see certain guys hitting, and there's guys that I like that I could see absolutely never being NFL or fantasy relevant. But I do like the depth of this class. I think there is going to be good variety, and depending on where guys land and the situation they're in, there's going to be some huge swings and misses, though, I think, in this class, because there are a lot of guys that I think have ability.
Boomer
and
bust.
I do think the class is deep, but you're just going to have some misses where guys end up that I think are good receivers end up in a bad situation. They end up in a bad team. They get stuck behind someone else on the depth chart, and they don't give you much early on. But I do like the depth of this class. I think maybe the superstar top end, especially last year when we had the Roma Dunzes, we had the Marvin Harrison Jr., we had Elite Neighbors. I mean, those guys who everyone was coveting in the top 10. You just don't see that in this group. Ted McMillan was getting pushed top 10 early on. Now it's, there's a lot of talk of, does he drop all the way to the 20s? And there's talk of, okay, does Emeka Buka and Luther Burden, are they even first rounders now? Or are they dropping second round? I think the over under right now is like 2.5 on first round wide receivers. So, Mather Golden's a guy that's actually gone up boards. He was a guy that probably wasn't considered a first rounder, now is. So I think there's a lot of potential in this class. I really like this wide receiver class. I'm not as down on it as other people. I just think there's less surefire, like, okay, that guy is absolutely going to crush. And I think there's a lot more like, oh, I like this guy. I really hope he ends up in a decent situation.
No,
don't you think?
I agree. There's a lot of like, I don't know, like, let's take a chance, but like 2 or 3 years down the line, maybe they could be phased out, maybe not. I think the depth, like we talked about, I think the depth is where it lies, but within that depth lies a lot of boom and bust, I feel like.
Yep. I think there's guys you're going to see go in like people are going to draft that went in the third round and end up doing nothing. And then there's guys I like in like the 5th, 6th round that I really think have a shot. But again, it's like, okay, they didn't get the draft capital. So what are the chances they're going to get a legit shot to play, even if I might like that player better at the next level? So I think we're going to have a lot of that, especially at this wide receiver group. Let's jump into our next prospect. This guy's another one. Super interesting. He is all over boards. I've seen this guy as high as 2. I've seen him like barely in the top 20 for other people. It's a crazy, like you said, we just don't know what to think about this group. And that is Kyle Williams out of Washington State, the Cougars out of Inglewood, California, 5'11", 190, put up another guy that showed out with a really, really nice showing that really kind of put him on people's radars at the combine, and ran a 4.4 flat with a 1.55 10-yard split, 36.5-inch vertical jump, 9.11 broad, all really good numbers from a guy his size. Started his career at UNLV, had some pretty productive years as a younger prospect, as a freshman, sophomore, junior there, eventually made the transfer over to Washington State, had a really solid first year there, 61 catches, 843 yards, 6 touchdowns, but then really hit his stride this last year, ended up with 70 catches, lead the team, 1,198 yards. He was 4th in FBS with 14 receiving touchdowns in 13 games, which is always big time if you can find a guy that can find the end zone. This is a guy as a slot receiver and a guy that could do a lot of stuff. I've seen people who just absolutely love this guy and think he is a top 5 stud. And I've seen other people are just like, I'm not sure about him. He's more in the teen to late teen, early 20 range for me. What are you thinking? What are your initial thoughts here on Kyle Williams out of Washington State?
I'm just going to rip the Band-Aid off and tell you right now. I'm one of those people that's come to borderline. I'll just say it. Love Kyle Williams. Right now, working through this, he's just inside my top 10 wide receivers for the draft. I'm talking about 9 or 10. And more evals and going back to some film. It's like I could absolutely see him getting his 5, 6, 7, somewhere borderline top 5, somewhere in there. Because I think people, one, underrate his inside out versatility. He can be a power slot. He can be a shifty guy. He can be a true X receiver. I think people underrate his separation skills and his insane athletic juice downfield. And let's not forget, guys, that he played with Cam Ward at Washington State for a year, and that was his quote unquote like preface to his breakout year, which was this past year where he absolutely went off over 1,000 yards, handful of touchdowns, like you said. So I think this guy has really good versatility. Predictively, I think like the NFL hasn't caught up with me and some other analysts who are really high on him too, where he goes early 4th round. But if he sneaks into the mid to late third round, I'm not batting an eye of the real NFL draft. Like, and I think this could be a deep rookie dynasty draft sleeper that no one knows about. Well, now I'm talking about they might, but before no one knows about, and you can get him late in drafts or even undrafted. Like that would be awesome. I just don't see. The only flaws is, I guess he's not like a full-time player. I think he's good as wide receiver 3/4, like an outside true X receiver specialist. But I think there's a lot of underrated qualities that people overlook, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, he's a guy who put up some numbers. He's another one of these guys that, didn't necessarily, go to a big school, a huge school. Even UNLV is a solid side school that went early on and then kind of made his way up. It has kind of shown, that he can kind of build himself. So I like Kyle Williams. He was a guy that wasn't like insanely high on my list. I saw the combine. I'm like, ooh, they saw that 40 time that pushed him up a little bit for me. I'm not as quite as high as some other people on him. I have him right around top 10, just outside my top 10 right now, but he's a guy that definitely is on my radar. And if he ends up sneaking in to the 3rd round of the NFL draft, then I definitely think I'm going to have to reevaluate where he goes. It's going to be interesting because, again, you see some analysts out there that absolutely love this guy that think he should be a 2nd round pick.
I'm not that high, but
I'm not as high as on him on that either. If he goes in the 3rd, he definitely moves up my list. I could see him going early 4th, possibly in the NFL draft. The question for me is, a guy like him, I like what I saw. I like the fact that he was fast. He put up some numbers. There's just a few other guys to me that are just slightly ahead of him where I would probably prefer to take that guy in the NFL draft, like in the 3rd round. And then that guy would probably go higher for me. And that's like a Jalen Royals out of Utah State, or like a Jalen Noel out of Iowa State. We just talked about teammate of Jaden Higgins, slot guy who also was about the exact same size as Williams, also ran in that 4.39, 4.4 range. So for me, like, Noel's a guy I like a little bit better. Same thing with Royals. I think he's close in talent wise to those guys. So if for some reason he ends up going significantly higher in the draft than those guys, then I might have to reevaluate whether I think I should move up and take Kyle Williams ahead of those guys for me when it comes to my fantasy drafts.
No, everything you said there, JT, is very like valid and great, fair points. Because, like you said, I think there are a few guys in his range, like Royals and Noel, Aomanor, something like that, Higgins, where they do have a more expansive and broader skill set than what Kyle Williams can do. But I'm telling you, as we get closer to the few weeks of the draft, I think he's going to rise. Like I don't think he has as expansive of a skill set as those guys, but I don't think he's too far behind.
Yeah, so that's where I'm at with him. I think he's in that grouping. He just happens to be at the bottom of that grouping for me. Now, if the NFL teams tell me they like him more than those guys, then that's where I'm going to make my adjustment there, because I definitely think he to me, he's in that like 3rd tier of wide receiver for me, at least right now.
Draft capital like matters a ton for fantasy. Like if a guy goes in the 2nd or 3rd round, that's significantly different than a 4th or 5th or even 6th round pick. Like the NFL tells you something on a guy that they're willing to take that high, you should probably get them on your fantasy team and trust that.
Yeah, exactly. A guy he kind of reminds me a little bit of is Marvin Mims, the Oklahoma wide receiver who went to the Broncos.
If only
So,
he
but
played more.
yeah, well, and then Mims is another guy. So he was a guy I like coming out.
Me
He
too.
went to Denver. You were like, okay, is this going to be a good spot for him? And then it turned around and like they just never played him. But when he
Sean Payton
played,
doesn't
he
play him
looked
yet.
pretty good. Like he actually made some pretty huge plays, but he just didn't see significant playing time. So that's going to be interesting to
Yeah.
see if a guy like Kyle Williams ends up in the same draft capital as like a Marvin Mims, but does he end up in a situation that's better where you get a coach that likes him more and is more willing to get a guy on the field? And some of that, honestly, we don't know. We're not in the locker room, so we don't know. Some of that sometimes can be like a guy just hasn't picked up the system. And so it's like they like the talent, but they just don't play him a lot because they just can't trust that he knows the plays, he knows the audibles, he knows the adjustments. So a lot of those times, those things can factor in with wide receivers. I think we maybe, as outsiders who aren't in the locker room are just not seeing that. And we're like, hey, when we see
Exactly.
a guy bust a huge play, we're like, look at that speed, look at that ability. Why is he not on the field more? And I think
Well,
maybe sometimes those
yeah.
are the situations that keep guys off the field.
Yep. I agree.
The third wide receiver we're going to talk about tonight before we jump into tight ends. This is another guy who really kind of made a name
Oh
for
man.
himself at the at the Senior
Senior
Bowl. The
Bowl,
Reese's
yeah.
Senior Bowl had a really nice game there. Ended up winning MVP. Had a really nice week in practice. People were talking about him coming up to the up to that Senior Bowl game, and then he ends up catching the winning touchdown. And that's Jack Betch, a TCU wide receiver, 6'1", 214. A guy out of Louisiana, a big recruit who ended up going to LSU. And he was kind of those tweeners at LSU where he kind of played tight end, kind of played wide receiver slot, did a few things. Actually had a really productive year as a freshman at LSU, 43 catches, 489 yards, and 3 touchdowns on a team that was just loaded with wide receiver talent. So the fact that he had that good of a game, a little bit of a step back his sophomore year, and then kind of pretty much was a reserve. And so then he turned around and transferred to TCU, really busted out this last year. He was second team all Big 12, led the team with 62 catches for 1,034 yards, 16.7 yards per catch, which is very nice, and 9 touchdowns in 12 games. He did not play in their bowl game, but like I said, when we saw him at the recent Senior Bowl, played really well there. A guy, that I think is jumping up people's boards. He's a smart wide receiver. He's a big wide receiver, seems to run routes well, plays bigger than he is. I think for his size, he's just a strong, tough kid. What are your initial thoughts here on Jack Betch?
So first, fun fact, like you went into it a bit, but I just want to provide some more context. As a freshman inline tight end, Jack Betch led LSU in receptions as just a freshman tight end, mind you, and that was with Kayshon Boutte, Malik Neighbors, and Brian Thomas Jr. on the team. Like, that's very extremely impressive. Also, once this guy transferred to TCU, he wore multiple hats, if you will. He lined up in the slot, he lined up on the outside, he took some jet sweeps, he played wildcat quarterback at times, lined up in the backfield, inline, everywhere. I think his role is best suited as like a tweener, like inside out versatility, but I think his best role in the NFL, if you will, is a power slot. Like for fantasy purposes, those guys we know will get funneled targets, get funneled dump offs. And if he lines up in the backfield, even better because he can take those cheap in PPR formats, those cheap jet sweeps, 1 point per reception type setups. And I really get excited about that power slot role. So I think that's his ideal role in the NFL. Have you seen like this kid in contested catch situations? They're not contested for him. He makes 50-50 balls look like 80-20 or 70-30. I know people have used that terminology a lot, but like it's true. The guy doesn't give up on a single play. We know the personal story with his brother Tiger Bash, sad story there, but he overcame at the Senior Bowl. Everyone was rooting for him. And like this isn't just a story guy, if you will. This guy can actually produce as a power slot in the NFL. I would very much take him in the early to mid second round. I know that might sound like significant spicy draft capital. I don't know where you're at, but I'm totally fine with it as a projection there.
Yeah, it's interesting because he's a guy. I'm not sure how high until we got in this offseason draft process that he was on NFL boards, but everything I'm hearing, people just seem to be really into this guy. They're liking everything they hear about him. Like I said, bigger guy, 6'1", 6'2", about 215, strong, but it plays really strong. Like you said, those 50-50 balls he goes and
Physicality is his
gets.
game.
He just uses physicality to overwhelm guys.
Definitely.
And again, at that size, I know sometimes we're so used to seeing these 4.4s now, and even guys are running the high 4.3s that you see those guys in the 4.5s, and people are like, "Ooh, 4.5, mid 4.5."
Consider the size.
Yeah, that's right. You look at their size, look at their strength. To me, that's not a problem. Going back to like Trey Harris, I know we talked about last week. He ran a 4.54, and people were like, "Oh, I don't know." And I was like, I thought that's what he would run because he was a guy that plays faster than he is actually just a straight line burner. So to me, that wasn't something I was worried about. I'm not that worried about that on Jack Bech either. I don't think that's not where he wins. It is straight line speed. So I like him. I think the 4.55 was actually plenty good of a time for him. For his types of abilities. Again, a highly rated kid out of high school. When he said talk about going to LSU, 4-star recruit. He's a guy that's real interesting to me. Couple guys that come to mind that he a little bit reminds me of. I think he could be them. I also think he could be better.
Yeah.
Xavier Hutchinson from Iowa State, that's at on the Texans right now, who's got a little bit of run the last couple of years, hasn't played a ton, and Cedric Tillman from Tennessee, that's on the Browns, as we saw Tillman have a little bit of a breakout last year. I think he's maybe a better Cedric Tillman.
Yeah, I do like I do like the Tillman call. I think Bech in an ideal world, I think right now he's even a more physical version of Tillman, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. I think he uses his body in that way. And to me, if he ends up on a team with a offensive coordinator that knows how to use him, can move him around, like you said, running those jet sweeps to him, use him as a power slot guy where he's mismatching him
Kyle
on
Shanahan.
you put him on on a slot corner where he's way bigger on a slot corner, or you get him matched up with a linebacker where he can work that linebacker with a quick juke move as he runs nice routes. He's a nice route runner. He's a guy I think has high upside. It's going to be really interesting to see how high he's gone up boards, because he was a guy that, again, wasn't getting a ton of hype early on, but then in the draft process, he's just seemed that everybody's really, really liked him. Gonna be interesting to see, does he get that draft capital? Is he a guy that can sneak into the second round, third round, somewhere in that range?
I think early to mid second round is a perfect range for him. I know it might surprise a lot of people, but that's where he's going. I think the NFL is a lot higher on him than even we are as a draft community.
Yeah, I've got him inside my top 10. I think he's right in that last late second round range for me as well. So depending on landing spot there, he's a guy that I could definitely be looking at to grab in that. We got a question here for Jamie. He says, where's Kyle Williams fall? Jamie, go back and listen. We just talked about Kyle Williams before you jumped on here. We had jumped we appreciate you jumping on. We just talked about him. Aiden's really high on him. I'm not quite as high, but he's in that tier 3 for me with a lot of other guys like Jalen Noel and Royals. I think depending on where he gets drafted, if he gets drafted over those guys, then maybe Kyle Williams moves up for me. He's right now just outside my top 10. Aiden, where'd you say you had Kyle Williams at?
I could move him up or down a few either way, but right now, working through it right now, temporarily, as things stand today, I have him. Let me look. Wide receiver 9/10 with a couple other guys.
There you go. So, Jamie said, sorry, working. I understand, man. I understand. Not a big deal,
problem.
But yeah, we're both like Kyle Williams. I think he's in that mix. I think he's a third rounder right now. It'll be interesting to see. I think he's like mid third to early fourth. It'll be interesting to see where he goes in that tier 3. If he goes quite a bit before some of those other guys, or if he's like in the middle of the end of that tier 3, that's going to adjust for me where I'm taking him in fantasy drafts.
Big riser.
What else do you like about Jack Bech before we move on to tight ends?
I think my favorite thing about him is versatility. And people say, oh, we can't find a home at one spot. Like, who cares? Isn't versatility what we want for fantasy? Like, in Debo's fantasy breakout, I'm not saying he's Debo. But in Debo's, I'm just the correlator here. In Debo's fantasy breakout season, he took jet sweeps, he took rushes. People say Luther Burden this, Jack Bash that. In fantasy, don't we want guys that can get schemed extra touches? Like, am I wrong about that? Or don't we want guys that can get schemed extra touches and get the ball in their hands and work after the catch any way possible?
Yeah, I think that you can look at guys that get scheme touches in different ways. I think some people in the analytical side of things go, well, they had to scheme touches because he couldn't manufacture his own touches. Where I'm on the other side of that, I'm like, teams are scheming touches for these guys because they're desperate. They're desperate to get the ball in their hands. Yeah. And they're not 100% sure the guys around them can get the ball to them. So they're force feeding them by making sure they get enough touches. I'm in that boat with Luther Burden. I know I'm
me too.
a bird lover, and I love him, and I'm super high on him. He's my wide receiver one. He's my wide receiver one in this class. But I think the issue with Missouri was it's not that he couldn't beat guys. It's not that he couldn't do it. They couldn't get him the ball, so they had to figure out different. Yeah, Brady Cook, a guy I love. I met Brady Cook at the combine. Guy's an all-time Mizzou great, but he played injured all year. And he just was not the same player last year as he was the year before. Gritty guy, did what he could, but the arm, he was hurt. He was hurt all year, and so they had to figure out different ways to give him the ball. So I'm not as worried about that because I think Missouri was manufacturing touches to make sure they were getting the ball in his hands more. So
I look at it as a positive, so.
I agree with you. I agree on that one.
Yeah.
No. We've got another quick question. Jamie says Jamie, I love Pat Bryant too. He likes Pat Bryant
last week
over Burton. I'll take Besh over Burton as well. So Jamie, loving both those guys. Hey, you're in my league. Let Burton drop to me, man. I'll let you have those guys, even though Pat Bryant, we talked about him on last week's show. He's Big one fan. Of my favorite sleepers in this draft. And then one more question here from Jamie. This wasn't on our list, but I'll ask you first, Aiden, who you like in these guys. So he said Jamie likes LeJohntay Wester better than Isaiah Bond, Wester out of Colorado, Bond out of Texas. Where do you sit on those two guys?
Okay, I know this was a hot topic in like our FIF family Discord chat a few weeks ago or whatever. I know a lot of people chimed in. Where I'm at, I'm not the biggest Bond fan because I'm fearful that he's just straight line speed and nothing else. That being said, I still have Isaiah Bond. I have no issues hearing arguments otherwise, but predictably for the NFL and me personally, I still have Isaiah Bond, not by an ocean like it used to be, but what do you think?
So for me, I think Bond's going to clearly go ahead of Wester in the draft.
Predictably, me too.
I think teams are going to go Bond first. Me personally, watching the film, I like Wester more. And for fantasy, there's a chance Wester goes really late. If Wester can even go in the 5th round as opposed to like the 7th, and he can get to a team that I like Wester's chances.
Yeah, well,
I like his chances. I like him better as a player. Like you said, I think Bond might be more of a straight line speed guy. I think he's a guy that we look at the metrics and we look at like just how fast he is and size and speed, everything like that. And you're like, oh, this guy should be really good. I just don't think he's that good of a wide receiver.
He's never produced wherever he is. He's never like, he always has this hype and this and that, Alabama, Texas, and he never meets the moment, I feel like.
Yeah. So I for me, if I had to take Bond in the 2nd round, or I can get Wester in my 4th or 5th round of my fantasy draft, I'd rather take the value on Wester. Personally, I just like him better as a player. I think Bond will go a couple rounds earlier than him in the NFL draft, but I would rather take a late round flyer on Wester that he has a shot at possibly making it.
Yeah.
Just my 2 cents on him.
Yeah.
Jamie says, "Gonna need to change your name. This is confusing." So because we got Jamie Perhug and Jamie M in the chat, so we got the two Jamies going at it. That's funny. Jamie M says Wester's a hot target in the red zone. He is. People who don't know about
Big
Wester, he
touchdown
led the
producer.
nation in receiving at Florida Atlantic before transferring to Colorado. He was the clear cut number one there, and then he had to earn some targets at Colorado with Travis Hunter there, Will Shepard, Jimmy Horn. I mean, they had a lot of mouths to feed in Colorado, but Wester was their number 2 wide receiver behind Travis Hunter last year. I just think he's a very underrated guy. I like him. There's a lot of guys kind of his size and speed in this draft, so I think it's going to be interesting to see where NFL scouts compare him to some of these other guys who they like just a little bit better, their profile, or whether they had an interview with him and prefer one guy over another guy because of an interview. Because I do think there's a lot of guys in this draft that are very similar talent wise.
Wester's probably in general most likely going to go undrafted in 99% of rookie drafts. If that's the case, I'll be picking him up everywhere.
I agree. Like if I have a deep rookie draft, he's a guy I'm going to be looking to probably take in like the 5th round of my rookie draft, especially if I have a couple 5th round picks. If it's a shorter draft or other guys fall to me, he's again going to be one of those first guys that's on my free agent list of guys to pick up post draft.
Yep, for sure.
So let's jump into tight ends here. As that's our group of wide receivers. Let's move on to our our favorite tight ends. The first guy we're going to start off with is guys, he's kind of all over the boards. That's kind of been the theme of this show. Some of these guys some people are super high on them, some are lower, and that's Harold Fannin Jr. out of Bowling Green. Just absolutely lit it up for them this year. Stats through the roof, just unbelievable year for him, but he's a little bit undersized, and then he did not have a great showing at the combine. He probably put together, in all honesty, one of the worst showings of every tight end there, and that's just for the speed height score. And the problem is, and just to kind of give people a heads up here, typically on these RAS scores and the athletic scores, tight ends, the top tight ends score through the roof just because they're the biggest, fastest kind of combo of a guy. They tend to put up these really, really great RAS and relative athletic scores and all that stuff. Fannin, the smallest tight end in the group at 6'4", 230, was only able to run in the 4.7 range. So people were hoping he would be faster because he's smaller. He didn't. So the question becomes, Aiden, do you think the production at the lower level at Bowling Green, do you think that kind of production, and even though he wasn't the most athletic guy and he's a little undersized, do you think he still finds a role in the NFL, not only on an NFL team, but can he carry some of that magic from college over into fantasy? As he was a guy who won a ton of CFF and a ton of C2C championships for people last year at tight end. Can he be productive for fantasy in the NFL?
Man, JT, this is a very complicated conversation coming in because you look at the production and metrics and numbers like, oh my God, this guy's breaking records left and right, fantasy god, monster in the NFL, whatever. Then you look at then you look at some of the deeper metrics and some of the athletic testing. And like you said, the pure size element, undersized and this and that. And you're like, oh, cause for concern here is he a 3rd or 4th round pick in the NFL draft. I don't know how to answer this because I don't want to freak everyone out here, make anyone flip out, but I'm nervous. Like Jaheim Bell last year is a deep sleeper for me. And like, I'm nervous that his team as a rookie won't be able to find a role for Fannin, like fullback, running back, screen wide receiver, move receiver, slot receiver, inline tight end. I'm nervous that he's going to get Jaheim Belled in the sense where he can't really find a home and he's not really athletic. And year one is kind of like a nothing burger. I don't know how you feel about that, but I feel like this is a good comparison, a fearful comparison, but you at least have to bring it up, and it's a complicated one.
Yeah, for me, just for recent memory, it reminds me a little bit of Jatavian Sanders last year from Texas. He was a guy that I was pretty high on coming into the draft process, and then he struggled at the combine. He didn't look really good. And next thing I know, I'm like, man, I might need to think about moving Sanders down my list because he came in as my clear-cut tight end 2 last year. And by the time it was all said and done, he was like my tight end 4 in the draft. I don't want to overreact too much with Fannin. because he was so productive in college.
He was.
But he's a guy, he's just going to have to be, man, he's going to really have to be on a team that knows how to use him exactly
Like
the
a
way
specific,
they want
I fear that he's a specific role player that will never find a home, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's my worry. My worry is he ever going to be a guy that gets on a team that really uses him as that kind of bigger slot wide receiver where they're just, peppering him nonstop with targets. That's my worry.
I hope he's not just a H-back guy and no one knows how to use him.
That's my worry is that teams are going to get in. They're like, oh, he's just not quite fast enough to burn the linebackers and like H-back. He's like not a great blocker, but we put him in.
Where do we put him? Yeah.
I'm worried about it. I tell you what, I'm really worried about it. He's fallen for me in drafts. Just because I don't know who's going to go after him. He's a guy I'm still going to take a chance on if he falls far enough to me. But he was going like early second, mid-second round in a lot of drafts like a month or two ago. And now I'm like seeing him more in like that mid to late third, early fourth. If he gets to the fourth round, I'm probably going to take a shot on him, but there is no way I'm spending a second round pick.
That's the thing. Fantasy. That's the key word you said there. Take a chance on him. Like, I don't think people are nearly as, and they shouldn't be nearly as excited a month or so ago. And now it's like, should we take a chance on him? And I think in terms of draft capital, this could be a big faller to the fourth and fifth round, unfortunately.
Yeah, I just think he's going to have to end up in the like almost a perfect ideal situation in the NFL for him.
Genius OC,
for him to end up being in that spot where he's good. You're going to see a ton of value for him because I just think teams are not going to leave him on the field to block. He just was not a good blocker in college. I mean, Bowling Green basically said you're our number one wide receiver pretty much, and they just threw to him all the time. Yeah, so it's just going to be interesting to kind of see. Where they think on him right now. He originally was like tight end, like 3-4 for me. I think he might be outside of my top 5 now. There's a couple other guys I just like a little bit more, and I think the NFL is going to like more. I really do. And so he is slowly sliding down my rankings.
For me, he's 6 or 7. I'm already there outside of the top 5. So.
Next guy, Jamie, I'm in an IDP draft, and Jamie says, how's IDP draft going? That's not going too bad. I tell you what, Jorge smoked me on Brock Bowers. I was trying to get the scoring from you to figure out exactly what the tight end scoring was in that league because I almost took Brock Bowers with my number 1 pick, and I was like, maybe he gets back to me, and he got picked right before me. So I did not get Brock Bowers on the way back. Pretty upset about that, but I guess I'll have to settle for Marvin Harrison Jr. I need to jump back in on that draft. I haven't checked out today. I was like at the end of the draft, I need to figure out where we're at on that. So, Jamie, good idea. As soon as I get off the pod, I'm going to jump in there and take a look at where I'm drafting on that. Next guy we have on our list, another tight end, a guy I'm super high on. I briefly brought him up last week in the show, even though he wasn't our main players we were talking about, and that is LSU tight end Mason Taylor. This is a guy I have been huge on all season. I've had him on a couple C2C and CFF leagues for a number of years. He's a guy that I really liked coming out of high school into college, going to LSU. He, to me, is just extremely underrated guy who's just going to keep moving up draft boards. 6'5", 251. His dad is Jason Taylor, the Hall of Fame defensive end of the Dolphins. The guy came out and looked really good, really smooth runner, really smooth. Everything he did at the combine just sold it for me that he was my tight end 3, and I'm all over him. I'm grabbing him like mid third round in drafts right now with the idea that there's absolutely no way that I'm going to get him mid third once the NFL draft happens. I think he's moving up into the early second round. And part of the reason I like him and the reason I'm probably going to slightly overpay for him this year in a lot of drafts is he was my tight end number 1 in next year's draft class. If he would have went back to LSU, I think he would have been the clear-cut tight end 1 in college football.
Did he have eligibility?
Yes, he came out early. He's a junior. He's been a 3-year starter at LSU. Very nice numbers. Again, playing with some guys who put up insane numbers at LSU the last couple of years. But he's been very, very solid. I'll pull up his stats here while you're giving us some of your thoughts. But to me, I'm going to overpay a little bit this year for him, knowing that if he would have went back to school, I would have had to buy him in the first round of fantasy drafts next year because he would have been tight end 1 in next year's draft class.
JT, I'm right there with you, man. I love Mason Taylor as well. You talked about the NFL bloodlines. The thing I always go back to is LSU, SEC, big games. You notice right away, jump off the page, if you will. Mason Taylor, to me, always shows up in the biggest moments, whether it be a big contested catch, a big block, red zone, whatever. Biggest moments, bright lights. He's there for the Jaden Daniels, Garrett Nussmeier, whoever it was. He's there. So like I said, I'm also willing to overpay a bit in rookie drafts. But for the real NFL draft, if he goes in the second or third round, it won't surprise us too, obviously, based on our love for him. But it's going to surprise a lot of the draft community, and it shouldn't. I think he's going to get significant, relatively, for his standard, significant draft capital. And people will be like, oh my God. But once they go back and watch the film and look back at it, they're like, oh yeah, maybe I should pay up a little bit in rookie drafts. I know I definitely will, like you mentioned.
Yeah, like I said, I've been getting sometimes in the second, waiting to the third in some mocks to see if I can get them.
Hard to do.
I don't think it's going to end up happening. Going back, looking at it, he was a freshman all SEC, started 13 of their 14 games, 38 catches, 414 yards, 3 touchdowns. Came back as a true sophomore, 36 catches, 348, and only 1 TD that season. So TDs have been a little low, but he's also played on teams with just TD monsters like Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. and Butte. I mean, he's in the mix with a lot of other guys. He was third team All SEC this last year, but he set a school record for tight ends with 55 catches. So this is what I'm trying to explain to people. Tight ends in college usually are not productive. We have just seen ultra, some of the top in all-time college football history. We've seen some of the top performances seasons ever in the last 3 years. I mean, we've seen just insane Fannin, Tyler Warren this year, Brock Bowers, in the early part of his career. These are some of the best performances of all time.
Ever, yeah.
So you take a guy like Mason Taylor, who 55 catches for 546 yards and 2 touchdowns in a regular year for a tight end. That damn near is going to lead the country. That is a fantastic season for a college football tight end. It's just when you compare those numbers next to Warren and Fannin catching over 100 balls, over 1,000 yards, double-digit touchdowns, his numbers just don't look as good. But in reality, they are absolutely outstanding numbers for a college tight end in typical settings. So for me, he's a guy just scratching the surface, early declare. I think he's a more athletic, more talented Dallas Goedert. To me, when I see him, I think he has a higher upside than that. And we've seen him have a pretty good career. I think Taylor has more upside than that. This is a guy in group chats for Colts fans, as everybody knows, I'm a Colts season ticket holder. He is now the guy everybody wants. Everyone says, hey, if we don't go Tyler Warren at 14 and we go defense at 14, everyone I know that is a Colts fan is like, Mason Taylor has to be our guy in the second round. That's our pick. If we don't go Warren in the first round or Warren gets drafted before we pick at 14, we go defense, either Campbell out of Alabama at linebacker, Barron cornerback out of Texas, go one of those spots and then take Mason Taylor in the second round. And I have to say, I would love that draft strategy. I love Tyler Warren. I think he'd be great as a Colt. If he doesn't get there, I am all about taking one of those other 2 positions and then taking Mason Taylor in the second round. I think it would be absolutely outstanding.
Yeah, right now, I don't know if you mentioned where you have him, but right now, Mason Taylor, he's my tight end 4/5 right now. Flip-flop, I go back and forth with the guy we're going to talk about last as we segue into that, but that's just what I have quick.
Yeah, and Jamie also brought up, I think Arroyo will be a nice sleeper tight end for most of us. I agree. Yeah. We both we talked about Arroyo on last week's episode. He's a guy that's right. Every one of us had him in the top 4 of our teams, 4 or 5, depending on where they're at. I've got Arroyo at 4. I got Mason Taylor at 3. And I said in last week's episode, if Arroyo and Mason Taylor would have came back to school this year, they would have been my tight end 1 and 2 in next year's draft with the idea that I thought both of them would have been first-round picks next year. So again, I'm buying the cheaper cost this year, knowing that I would have had to probably pay a first for those guys next year. So Arroyo, I think definitely another guy, real nice sleeper. We talked about it, great athleticism. If it wasn't for the injury concerns and the seasons he's missed, I think he'd be even higher up people's boards. But I think, like you said earlier, Aiden, I think people are going to be real surprised in the draft, in the fantasy community, when Arroyo and Mason Taylor go a lot higher in the NFL draft than they thought they would.
And they shouldn't be surprised, but they will be.
But they will be. They're just, and that's the thing is people just tight ends, tend to fall through the cracks a little bit when you're talking about rookie drafts and things like that. The last tight end we're going to talk about as we close out the show tonight, another nice sleeper, a guy that I think is being underrated right now and hasn't been getting a lot of buzz.
Yes.
But I think the buzz is coming for him because I think he's much better than people realize, and not a lot of people necessarily maybe saw him play this year. And that is Terrence Ferguson, tight end out of Oregon, 6'5", 255, ran a 4.63 40 at the draft. A guy, it's a very, very solid blocker. He was a nice blanket, safety blanket for Dylan
Gabriel.
Dylan Gabriel. Thank you. I'm like, I totally was like going to say his name backwards. Dylan Gabriel. I think he's going to be a nice day 2 guy. I could see him going late second, early third round as well. He's a guy I absolutely will be looking at in the third or fourth rounds of my fantasy drafts. If I miss out on one of those top tight ends, say I don't get a Loveland, I don't get a Tyler Warren, I don't get a Mason Taylor or Arroyo, Ferguson's a guy. If I need some tight ends on my team, he's a guy that I'm going to be looking at just a little bit later in fantasy drafts. What do you think about Ferguson?
Sorry, I was just pulling up my notes. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Terrence Ferguson, I go back to just look at the talent this guy's been surrounded by the last 2 or 3 years in the Oregon offense. I mean, just in the backfield alone, Bucky Irving, Jordan James, then passing game weapons he's been surrounded with, Evan Stewart, Tez Johnson, Troy Franklin, who are all extremely good in their own right, and teams not in the NFL, at least in terms of college production. In the 5th or 6th option, the passing game, let alone rushing game as well, this guy still produced every single year. Right now, I have him starting 3/4. Again, I think I lean Ferguson over Taylor, but it really depends on the day and my mood as I look at the film and stuff, deeper analytics. But I really love Terrence Ferguson as well. And I always go back to he produced with like a collection of big-time weapons around him.
Yeah, Ferguson, just a guy that, again, really solid seasons. The issue is we just look at some of these guys put up such huge years that some of these guys that actually had really good seasons just kind of got lost in the mix because of everything else going on. This is a guy I think NFL scouts are going to love. To me, he's solidly day 2. I think he makes it into the second round. He definitely, if he doesn't go in the second round, I think there's no way he goes outside of the third round. Guy's just too talented, has got too much skill, and he can do a little bit of everything. He's a really well-rounded tight end. We've seen, some of these guys are just really good receivers, or we see the really big guys that are fast and strong, but they don't really have the receiving profile. To me, he's one of the best well-rounded guy. He can receive, he can block, he can do a little bit of anything. He can play in the slot, he can play in line. I like his blocking skills. I think his blocking skills and Mason Taylor's blocking skills, I think they're 2 of the better guys in this class. They maybe didn't show it on tape all the time, but they definitely have the ability. They have the potential and the ability, if they work on it more and they get the right coaching, I think these guys can become very, very good blockers at the next level. So Ferguson is a guy definitely moving up my board. And when we talk about the slight slip of Fannin, outside of my top 5, that's where I'm at. Ferguson to me has kind of risen up. I think he's tight end 5 for me, and Fannin is now down to 6. Even 6 to 7 as we're going to talk about it. One last guy we didn't really have on the schedule, but one of the guys I really like, Aronde Gadsden, excuse
sleeper.
me.
He's my day 3 guy.
He's my big time sleeper out of Syracuse. He's a guy a little bit like Fannin. I think needs to end up in the right situation, but he was one of those guys size wise. He was much bigger at the combine when they Chester's measurements, I thought he might be a little smaller, like in that 230 range, like Fannin was. He actually measured in at like 245, which I was super excited about. I was like, man, he's definitely bigger than I thought. He looked big. He catches the ball really well. He's a guy that burst on the scene a couple years ago for Syracuse and then had an injury plague season 2 years ago, and people kind of forgot about him a little bit, but then came back with a really nice year as kind of the number one target for Kyle McCord this year. Gadsden's a guy, keep an eye out on him. I think there's going to be a team that falls in love with him, and he's going to end up going earlier in the NFL draft than I think people originally thought. To me, he's a guy that could slip into that top 5-6 to me, depending on where he actually gets drafted.
I agree. People forget this, but that with Kyle McCord, the Quint Allen, Jackson Meeks, Pena, everyone around there, this Syracuse offense was extremely high-powered this past season. I pay attention to Syracuse offense like every week. I only live like about an hour and a half away, give or take. So I'm obviously glued in, tapped in, whatever you want to call it. This was extremely high-powered offense, and I love the Fannin comparison. I don't want to like be overly harsh and rude to Fannin, but I think Gadsden, maybe he's deployed similarly to Fannin. I just think he's much more athletic and has much better athletic tools than Fannin, if that makes sense.
I absolutely agree with you. I agree with you. I think he's one of those guys that they would have switched situations and you would have put him on Bowling Green. He would have put up the same types of stat totals because his stats were still fantastic at Syracuse. So it's not like he didn't have great stats. They just weren't quite as good as Fannins. I would prefer him definitely is at the price. He was definitely what I would take him instead. Jamie jumped back in here and says Bartholomew from Pittsburgh is a name we should remember. He's a guy that's going to be kind of a sleeper. I think he's going to be that free agent guy you pick up off the waiver wire after your draft. I think he's got some skill. I think he's a guy for me in deeper leagues. I'm probably going to be picking him up and stashing him on a taxi squad. If I have a league where I can keep a guy on the taxi for maybe 2 years, that's the type of guy I want to draft and maybe hold on to him, knowing that he's not going to probably make anywhere near my lineup here in the next year or two, but there's a chance that he can move his way up because I do think he has some skill. I had him on a couple college teams as well. I do like him as far as that's concerned. We do have a show coming up right after us, so we're going to have to jump out of here. No Shoot the Gap tonight for everybody that usually watches Shoot the Gap. Jorge, like we said, he's on the IR this week. We got sickness. He's out for us this week. Hopefully he'll be back next week. So no Shoot the Gap, but we do have Fourth and Frames coming up. So we're going to jump right into those guys next here on Fantasy and Frames. If you haven't, please go like, subscribe, follow us, leave us a comment on YouTube. Hit that notification button so you know when we're coming on. If you could also go to any of the podcast platforms, please like and review us there, as well as usually our podcasts come out the next day. The next morning we do these live shows that we do on YouTube come out on the podcast form the next day. Aiden, anything you want to throw in here right at the end before we say goodbye to the people?
No, I love this. This 2 weeks long conversation has been great in wide receivers and tight ends. I love to study wide receiver film. I love to study tight end film for fantasy purposes. I cannot wait. We are only about 3 weeks away from the draft. It's 3 or 4 weeks. It's going to be
here before we know it, man. I love it. My favorite time of the year. Draft is coming. It's going to be here in no time.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining me here. We're saying bye to you guys for Jorge. We'll hopefully have him back here soon. Stick around for the next show here on Fantasy and Frames coming up next. For Aiden, I'm JT. We appreciate it. We'll check you next time.